It is January 1860. A Frenchman is cutting his way through the forests of Cambodia, and he is dying, though he does not know it yet. His name is Henri Mouhot. He is 33 years old, a naturalist, a collector of beetles and river shells, far from home, deep in country that no European map describes with any confidence. For weeks, he has followed rivers and elephant tracks. His guides are local men who already know this place. The fever that will kill him within the year is already in his blood. And then the trees open. In front of him stands a tower of grey stone, then another, then 5, rising out of the canopy like something that should not be there. A moat as wide as a river, walls carved end to end with marching armies, with gods, with rows of dancing women. A temple larger than anything he has seen in all of Europe, swallowed to its shoulders in vine and root and silence. He writes that night by candlelight. One of these temples, he says, a rival to that of Solomon, erected by some ancient Michelangelo, might take an honorable place beside our most beautiful buildings. He believes he has found a lost city. He is wrong about that in ways that will matter, but he is not wrong about the stone. What he has walked into is the wreck of the largest city the world had ever built before the age of machines, a capital that once held close to 1 million people, an empire that ruled most of mainland Southeast Asia for 6 centuries, and then somehow let the forest take it back. Mouhot will be dead within 18 months. Jungle fever near the border with Laos. His own grave will be lost to the same forest for more than 100 years. But the temples he described will never be forgotten again. This is Cambodia. To understand what Mouhot walked into, you have to understand the scale of it. At its height, around the year 1200, the city of Angkor spread across roughly 1,000 square kilometers. Not the temples alone, the whole living city. Wooden houses, markets, rice paddies, reservoirs, raised roads, all of it. Modern surveys call it the most extensive urban complex of the pre-industrial world, larger in footprint than the 5 boroughs of New York. Home, at its peak, to somewhere near 750,000 people, when London held perhaps 50,000. And almost none of it survives. The kings built their gods a home in stone. They built their own homes in wood. The wood is gone. What the forest left standing were the temples, and even those it tried to swallow. Go to the temple called Ta Prohm today, and you can watch it happening, frozen in slow motion. The roots of the silk cotton tree pour over the walls like wax down a candle. They split the lintels. They cradle whole doorways in a grip that has taken 300 years to close. The stone did not fall here. The forest grew through it, branch by branch, season by season, until you cannot say any longer where the temple ends and the tree begins. This is the image most of us carry of Cambodia, the ruin in the jungle, the empire the forest ate. But that image hides the real question. Not how the forest took it, how it was ever built in the first place, and why the people who built it would walk away. To find the answer, you have to leave the temples behind and go to the water. Cambodia sits on a low, flat plain in the heart of mainland Southeast Asia. The Mekong River runs down through the middle of it, one of the great rivers of the world, carrying water and silt all the way from the Tibetan Plateau to the South China Sea. But the strangest thing the Mekong does, it does inside Cambodia, and it does it backwards. For half the year, the river behaves the way rivers are meant to behave. It flows downhill, south, toward the sea. But when the monsoon comes and the Mekong swells with meltwater and rain, something happens that happens almost nowhere else on Earth. A tributary called the Tonlé Sap, which normally drains a great lake into the Mekong, stops, then reverses. The flood is so powerful that it pushes the water back upstream into the lake, and the lake begins to grow.
In the dry season,
the Tonlé Sap Lake covers around 2,500 square kilometers. By the height of the flood, it can swell to 10,000. In a strong year, more. It becomes, for a few months, the largest freshwater lake in Southeast Asia, breathing in and out with the seasons like a living thing. And in that breath is the reason a civilization could grow here at all. When the flood retreats, it leaves behind a drowned forest and a flooded plain thick with fish. The Tonlé Sap is one of the most productive inland fisheries on the planet. To this day, it provides the majority of the protein eaten by the people of Cambodia. The fish feed the people. The flood feeds the fish. The river feeds the flood. 1,000 years ago, the kings of the Khmer looked at this rhythm and understood something. If you could hold the water, if you could catch the flood when it came and release it when it was gone, you could grow rice not once a year, but 2 or 3 times. And rice, in this part of the world, was not just food. Rice was power. On the shores of that lake, the floating villages still stand. Whole communities built on stilts and on rafts, their houses rising and falling with the water. There are floating shops, floating schools, floating temples, even floating gardens of vegetables grown on rafts of woven reed. In the dry months, the stilt houses stand high and absurd on their long, thin legs, 10 meters above cracked mud. Then the flood comes, and the water climbs the legs, and the village floats free again. The children paddle to school in canoes. The fishermen set their nets in the drowned forest. They have done this for centuries. The lake gives and the lake takes, and the people have learned to live in the space between. At a place called Prek Tol, on the northwestern edge of the lake, the flooded forest becomes something else again. It is one of the most important waterbird colonies left in Southeast Asia. In the breeding season, the drowned trees fill with storks and pelicans and ibis. Among them, the greater adjutant, a stork so large and so strange it looks almost prehistoric, standing as tall as a child, with a heavy bill and a bare neck. It has vanished from most of the region. Here, in the flooded forest, a few hundred still nest. The rhythm that fed an empire feeds them too. And in the deep pools of the Mekong itself, far up the river near the town of Krachi, swims one of the rarest creatures in all of Cambodia, the Irrawaddy dolphin, a round-headed, almost smiling river dolphin, grey and shy, that surfaces with a soft breath and slips under again. They were once common along hundreds of kilometers of the Mekong. Now only a small population survives, clinging to a handful of deep pools, threatened by nets and by the dams rising upstream. To the people who live along the river, the dolphins are sacred, ancestors in another form, and their slow disappearance is felt as a kind of grief. A few dozen remain. The great river that carries the country's life carries them too, for now. So the water was the foundation. Now we can ask, who built on it? The Khmer did not begin with Angkor. Long before the great temples, the lower Mekong held kingdoms whose names survive only in fragments. The first the Chinese travelers wrote of was Funan, a trading power on the delta that grew rich on the sea routes between India and China more than 1,500 years ago. After Funan came Chenla, a kingdom of the inland plains, and from Chenla rose the towers of Sambor Prey Cook, brick shrines wrapped in carved lions and flying palaces, raised in the centuries before Angkor was even imagined. Through these kingdoms came the gods of India and the Sanskrit language and the idea of the Temple Mountain. The Khmer took all of it and made it their own and waited for the king who would bind the pieces together. That king's story begins on a mountain. Northeast of the temples rises Phnom Kulen, the mountain of the lychees. It is a sandstone plateau, green and quiet, with waterfalls and carved riverbeds. And in the year 802, on its heights, a king named Jayavarman II held a ceremony that would echo for 600 years. He declared himself Chakravartin, universal ruler, God King. It was not a conquest. There was no great battle that day. It was an idea. The idea that one man could be the link between heaven and earth, the center around which everything else turned. Historians mark that ceremony as the birth of the Khmer Empire, the moment a scatter of warring princes became a single kingdom with a single divine head. And the kings who followed turned that idea into stone and water on a scale that still defies belief. This is where the genius of Angkor lives, not only in the temples, in the engineering underneath them. The Khmer built reservoirs they called barrays, vast rectangular basins, the largest of them 8 kilometers long and more than 2 kilometers wide, holding tens of millions of cubic meters of water. They cut canals to feed them. They raised embankments to hold them. They linked the whole landscape into a single machine for managing water, the most extensive network of its kind anywhere in the pre-industrial world. In the wet season, the system captured the flood. In the dry season, it released the stored water across the rice fields. It let the city grow far past the natural limits of the land. The water built the empire. Remember that, because the water will also end it. The cleverness was in the slope. The plain at Angkor tilts very gently from the mountains in the north down toward the lake in the south. The Khmer read that tilt like engineers. They placed their great reservoirs to catch the water coming down, then ran their canals along the fall of the land, so that gravity alone carried water from the high barrays to the fields below. No pumps, no machines, only an entire landscape reshaped into a single, slow, falling system, fed at the top by the monsoon and the mountains, draining at the bottom into the lake. For 3 centuries it worked. It turned a seasonal plain into a city that never went hungry. And at the heart of the machine, the kings built for their gods. In the early years of the 12th century, a king named Jayavarman II began the temple that would become the symbol of an entire nation, Angkor Wat. It is, to this day, the largest religious monument on Earth. 3 times the size of the Vatican, a mountain of sandstone shaped into the form of the universe itself. 5 towers, like the peaks of the sacred mountain at the center of the world. A moat around it, nearly 200 meters wide, standing in for the cosmic ocean. To walk toward it across the long stone causeway is to walk, in the language of the builders, from the world of men toward the dwelling of the gods. The numbers are hard to hold in the mind. The temple was raised in something close to 30 years. It took an estimated 300,000 workers and many thousands of elephants to move the stone. The sandstone itself was quarried at the foot of Phnom Kulen and floated down canals to the site, block by block, some weighing more than a ton, fitted together so tightly that in many places you cannot slide a blade between them. There is no mortar. There is only weight and precision and time. And then there are the walls. Around the temple run galleries of carved stone, hundreds of meters of them, telling the old stories. On one long wall, gods and demons heave at the body of a giant serpent, wrapped around a mountain, churning the ocean to draw the elixir of immortality from the sea. It is the great creation myth of the Hindu world, and the Khmer carved it at a length and a depth no one had attempted before. On other walls, kings ride to war, armies march, ships row across stone water, and the punishments of hell wait below for the wicked. There is one more strange thing about Angkor Wat. It faces west. Almost every Khmer temple opens toward the rising sun, to the east. Angkor Wat opens the other way, toward the setting sun, toward the direction the Khmer associated with death and with the god Vishnu. Many scholars believe Jayavarman II built it not only as a temple, but as his own tomb, a place where, in death, he would become one with the god he served. At the spring equinox, the sun rises directly over its central tower. 800 years on, the crowds still gather in the dark to watch it happen. And among the gods and the armies, carved over and over, thousands of times, are the apsaras, celestial dancers, each one different, each with her own face, her own jewelry, her own arrangement of hair. 8 centuries old and still smiling out of the stone. Angkor Wat was built as a Hindu temple, dedicated to the god Vishnu. But Cambodia did not stay Hindu, and the next great king would remake the empire again. His name was Jayavarman VII, and he came to the throne in a moment of catastrophe. It is the year 1177. A war fleet of the Cham, the Khmer's great rivals from the coast to the southeast, comes silently up the river and across the lake, and falls on Angkor before the city can defend itself. The capital burns. The king is killed. For a people who believed their king held the universe itself together, it is the end of the world. Jayavarman VII drove the Cham out, and then he did something stranger. He turned away from the old gods. He was a Buddhist, and the city he built in the ruins of the old one, Angkor Thom, the great city, was a Buddhist vision of the world. At its center, he raised the Bayon, a temple unlike anything before it. From its towers, more than 200 enormous stone faces look out in every direction, calm, half smiling, eyes lowered. Some believe they are the face of the Bodhisattva of compassion. Some believe they are the face of the king himself. Perhaps the builders meant for you not to be able to tell the difference. Jayavarman VII was a builder of more than temples. The inscriptions he left credit his reign with more than 100 hospitals scattered across the empire, open to the sick, stocked with healers and medicine and rice. With more than 100 rest houses spaced a day's walk apart along the royal roads, so that travelers and pilgrims and messengers would always have shelter for the night. With reservoirs and bridges and stone causeways reaching out across the land, binding the empire together not only by force, but by road and by water. Under him, the empire reached its greatest extent, covering much of what is now Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam. He carved his own face into the heart of his capital and turned it to watch over all of it. And on the outer walls of the Bayon, the carvers did something no Khmer temple had done before. They turned away from the gods and carved the people. Along those galleries, instead of myths, you find ordinary Khmer life from 800 years ago. Fishermen hauling nets from the lake, women cooking over fires, a market in full haggle, men betting on a cockfight, a woman giving birth attended by midwives, soldiers and porters and servants and cooks. It is the only picture we have of how the people of Angkor actually lived, because everything else about them, their houses, their tools, their words, was made of wood and breath, and is long gone. The kings wrote themselves into stone as gods. By accident, almost, they left us the only proof that anyone else was there at all. It was the summit, and like all summits, it could only be held for so long. Carved across the galleries of the Bayon, among the gods and the armies, is a record of how that empire moved and fought. And one figure appears again and again: the elephant. The Khmer went to war on elephants. They built with elephants. They carried their kings on elephants. The terrace at the front of the royal palace is still called the Terrace of the Elephants. Its wall, a parade of carved trunks and tusks, reaching out toward the open square where the army once gathered. The descendants of those animals still walk the forests of Cambodia. In the eastern plains and in the mountains to the southwest, wild Asian elephants still move in small herds through country that has grown quiet around them. They are fewer now, far fewer, but the same species that hauled the stone for Angkor Wat still pushes through the same green shadow, 800 years on, in a land that has forgotten almost everything else about the empire that revered it. Out east, where the forest opens into dry woodland and grass, lies a landscape some have called the Serengeti of Asia. Herds of banteng, a wild ox, once moved across it in the thousands, alongside deer and wild pig and the predators that hunted them. It was, not long ago, one of the last places in Southeast Asia where a tiger might still walk. But the tiger is gone from Cambodia now. The last confirmed wild one was recorded more than a decade ago, and none have been seen since. The country that put the lion and the elephant on its temple walls has lost its great cat entirely to the snare and the gun and the shrinking of the wild. There is talk now of bringing tigers back from India, of starting again. The forest is still there, waiting, mostly empty. Not far from the great temples stands one of the most delicate things the Khmer ever made: Bante Shray, the citadel of the women. A small temple, built not by a king, but by a court priest, cut from a rose-pink sandstone that seems to hold the light. Its carvings are so fine, so deep, so crowded with detail, that for a long time people refused to believe they were 1,000 years old. The hand that carved them is gone. The stone remembers it perfectly. And there are others scattered through the forest, each with its own broken story. Far to the north stands Koh Ker, where, for a brief and strange 20 years in the 10th century, a rival king moved the capital and built a 7-tiered pyramid that rises out of the trees like a step to nowhere. To the west, near the border, the long galleries of Bante Chamar lie half-collapsed and almost empty of visitors, their carved walls slowly folding into the forest. And high on a cliff at the very edge of the Dangrek Mountains stands Priya Vihir, a temple strung out along 1,000 meters of stone, looking out over the plains from the top of a sheer drop, built across 2 centuries by a line of kings who each added their own stair and shrine to the climb. Each of them a chapter, each of them in time given back to the forest. Because that is the other character in this story, not the kings. The jungle. Southwest of the temples, the land rises into the Cardamom Mountains, and here the forest is not a ruin. It is alive, and it is one of the wildest places left in all of Southeast Asia. More than 90% of the Cardamoms still stand in unbroken forest. They hold more than 500 species: Asian elephants, clouded leopards, sun bears, the Sunda pangolin, the strange scaled creature that rolls into an armored ball, hunted across Asia almost to nothing, and the gibbons. In the early morning, before the heat, the pileated gibbon begins to sing. It is not a call so much as a duet. The pair sing together, a rising, looping cry that carries for more than a kilometre through the canopy, marking the territory they have held, the same family in the same trees, year after year. They never come down. They live their whole lives in the high branches, swinging hand over hand through a world that exists nowhere on the ground. To hear them at dawn is to hear the forest the way it sounded long before any king carved his face into stone. And in the rivers of these same mountains lives a survivor that should, by every measure, already be gone. The Siamese crocodile. A freshwater crocodile, smaller than its saltwater cousin, once spread across the rivers of Southeast Asia, and now vanished from almost all of them. Hunted for its skin, drowned out by dams, crossbred away in farms. In the wild, only a few hundred are thought to remain, and the largest population left clings to the remote streams of the Cardamoms. Conservationists raise the young in captivity now and carry them back into the mountains and release them into the few rivers quiet enough to still hold them. It is a thin thread, but it has not broken yet.
The forest gives strange gifts,
and one of them is eaten. On the highway north of the capital sits a small market town called Skuon. The travelers who pass through it have given it another name, Spiderville, because here the women stand at the roadside holding wide trays piled high with tarantulas. Black, hairy, the size of a human palm. Deep fried in oil and salt and garlic and sugar until the legs go crisp and the body inside turns soft. The Khmer call them a ping, the Thai zebra tarantula, and people eat them by the handful. No one is entirely sure how it began, but almost everyone who tells the story tells the same one. They say it began with hunger. In the years of the famine, when there was nothing in the fields and nothing in the markets, People went into the forest and ate whatever the forest held: roots, insects, frogs, and the fat tarantulas that burrowed in the jungle floor. It was survival. It was the difference between living and not. And when the famine passed, the spiders stayed on the plate. What began as the food of the desperate became a thing eaten for pleasure, then a thing sold to tourists, then a small point of pride. A reminder, the older people say, of what they once endured and outlived. But even that is fading now. The vendors say the spiders are growing scarce. The forests where they burrowed are being cut for cashew and rubber, and the hunters must travel farther each year to find them. The crisp little symbol of survival is being pushed out by the same thing pushing out the gibbon and the crocodile and the elephant. The forest itself is going. The spider is not the only small creature the Khmer turned into food. In the mango and cashew trees, a red ant builds its nest by pulling living leaves together and stitching them shut with silk drawn from its own young. The Khmer climb up after them, nest and all. The ants and their pale eggs go into the pan with beef and basil and chili, sharp and sour and bright. It is one of the oldest tastes in the country, older than any king, a flavor pulled straight out of the canopy. The smallest things in the forest, the ant and the spider, fed the people when nothing larger would. The empire ate from the same jungle that buried it. And yet, through all of it, something of the old empire has refused to die. When the temples emptied, the gods changed, and the kings moved away. The Khmer people did not vanish. They carried their faith and their art with them, and softened it, and kept it. The dances carved on the walls of Angkor Wat still move today. The Apsara dance, the slow, precise, impossibly graceful court dance of Cambodia, survived century after century, taught in secret, passed from teacher to student, the fingers bent back into shapes the stone dancers hold even now. It came closer to dying in the 1970s than in all the centuries before. When the country turned on its own artists, the royal dancers were hunted along with the rest, and by some counts, 9 in 10 of Cambodia's classical performers were lost. The dance that had outlived the empire nearly did not outlive the men who tried to erase it. But a handful survived, in the camps and across the border, carrying the steps in their bodies. And when it was over, they came back and gathered the children and began to teach the shapes again, hand by hand, finger by finger. The dance on the walls is on the stage once more. Theravada Buddhism, which arrived as the empire was fading, became the quiet heartbeat of the country. In village after village, the orange robe still moves at dawn. The monk still walks with his bowl, the people still kneel. The grandeur went into the forest. The faith stayed in the people. And that, in the end, is the thing the early explorers got most wrong. Muho believed he had found a lost city, but Angkor was never lost. The Khmer had never left it. Through all the centuries, the temples stood half-drowned in jungle. Monks lived among them, lit incense at their altars, kept the great causeway swept. Portuguese travelers wrote of Angkor 300 years before Muho. A French missionary described it just before he arrived. The local guides who led him through the trees did not stumble on the towers. They knew exactly where they were. It was lost only to Europe, and only Europe got to write the story down. And once Europe had the story, it came back for the stone.
The French,
who by then ruled Cambodia, set scholars to work on Angkor. They founded an institute, cut back the jungle, and slowly learned to lift the fallen temples and rebuild them, block by numbered block, a painstaking method of putting the original stones back exactly where they had stood. Much of what visitors walk through today was raised from rubble this way. But the same fascination that saved the temples also stripped them. In 1923, a young Frenchman named André Malraux, who would later become a famous writer, went out to the fine pink temple of Bante Sray and hacked nearly a ton of carved goddesses out of its walls to sell. He was caught and tried, and the pieces were returned. He was only the most famous of many. The forest had guarded Angkor for 4 centuries. The men who admired it most could do more damage in an afternoon. So if the city was never truly lost, then we are back to the harder question. Why did the kings abandon the greatest capital their world had ever seen? And the answer, when it finally came from the water. For a long time, the fall of Angkor was a mystery. People blamed war, they blamed religion, they blamed a kind of vague exhaustion, an empire that simply ran out of strength. But in recent decades, scientists have read the land itself. They have studied the rings of ancient trees, which record the rains of centuries. They have dug into the canals and the reservoirs and traced where the water went. And a story emerged that is more frightening than any invasion. In the 14th and early 15th centuries, the climate turned against Angkor. First came decades of weak monsoons, drought. For a city that lived and breathed by water, a city whose entire genius was the management of water, the rains simply failing was a slow catastrophe. The reservoirs ran low, the rice failed. And then, after the drought, came the opposite extreme. Years of monsoons so violent they tore through the very system built to control them. The canals silted and broke. The embankments collapsed. The machine that had made the impossible city possible began, channel by channel, to fail. The water that built Angkor unbuilt it. A city of close to 1 million people cannot survive the failure of the thing that feeds it. People drifted away, south toward the great river and the lake, toward trade with the wider world, toward land that did not depend on 1,000 kilometers of failing canals. The center of Khmer life moved toward what is now Phnom Penh. The Khmer tell a gentle story about how that city began. A woman named Pen, living by the river, found 4 bronze statues of the Buddha washed up in the trunk of a tree carried down by the flood. She raised a small hill, a Phnom, to house them. The city that grew around that hill took her name, Phnom Penh, the Hill of Pen. Today, it is the capital, a low, sprawling city on the meeting of 3 rivers, where the Mekong and the Tonlé Sap braid together, and the old royal palace still glints gold above the water. The kings of Cambodia rule from here now, not from Angkor. The empire's heart, when it failed in the north, simply moved south and went on beating. It beats there still. And in the year 1431, the armies of the Siamese kingdom to the west came and sacked the old capital one final time. By then, much of it had already gone quiet. Angkor was not destroyed in a single night. It was not buried by a volcano or drowned by a flood. It died the way most great things die, slowly, quietly, as the people who needed it found they needed it no longer, and walked away, and let the forest do the rest. And the forest was patient. Within a few generations, the wooden city was simply gone. The houses, the palaces, the bridges, the markets, all of it timber, all of it returned to the soil. The rice fields went to scrub, and the scrub went to forest. The roots found the temples. And by the time Mu Ho came hacking through the green in 1860, what was left was what we still see. Islands of stone in an ocean of trees. An empire reduced to its skeleton. What happened next to Cambodia is harder to tell, but it cannot be left out. The French made the country a colony and held it for 90 years. Independence came in the 1950s, and then the wars of the wider region spilled across the border, and out of that chaos rose something that would do to the living people of Cambodia what the forest had done to the stones. It is the 17th of April, 1975. A movement of communist revolutionaries called the Khmer Rouge marches into Phnom Penh, and the city falls. They call it Year Zero. History, they declare, begins again from nothing, and within days they empty the capital. The entire population, the sick, the old, the newborn, is marched out at gunpoint into the countryside to work the fields. Money is abolished, religion is abolished, schools, books, music, the family itself, all of it is to be erased and remade. What follows is one of the worst crimes of the 20th century. The Khmer Rouge set out to destroy everyone they decided was impure, the educated, the professionals, anyone who had worn glasses, spoken a foreign language, lived in a city, or simply seemed to know too much. In a former school in Phnom Penh, a place they called S21, around 20,000 people were photographed, tortured, and sent to their deaths. Of the 20,000 who entered, perhaps 12 came out alive. The fields where the bodies were buried earned a name the world would not forget: the killing fields. In 4 years, between 1.5 and 2 million people died, executed, starved, or worked to death. Close to a quarter of everyone in the country. It was not war, exactly. A society turned upon itself and tried to murder its own mind. In 1979, the Vietnamese army crossed the border and drove the Khmer Rouge from power. But the killing had already been done. An entire generation of teachers, doctors, artists, and monks was gone. The knowledge they carried died with them, and a country already reduced to ruins in stone was now hollowed out in flesh and memory. There is a bitter irony at the center of it. The Khmer Rouge, who tried to erase the whole of Cambodia's past and begin the world again at zero, kept one image. They put it on their flag: the 5 towers of Angkor Wat. Even the men who burned the country's memory could not let go of the temple in the trees. It was the one thing too deep to destroy. And so we come back, at the end, to the forest and to the stone it took. For more than 4 centuries, the jungle held Angkor in its grip, and the strange truth is that the forest did not only swallow the empire, it also saved it. The trees that pried apart the lintels also hid the temples from those who would have quarried them for stone or burned them for lime. The vines that strangled the gates also kept the looters out. The silence that fell over Angkor was the silence of preservation. Mu Ho found the towers still standing because nothing for 400 years had been allowed to take them down. The forest is what survived of the empire, and the forest is the reason anything else did. But the forest kept a secret far larger than anyone knew. and it took a machine that did not exist in Muho's time to find it. In the early 2010s, an archaeologist named Damien Evans tried something new. He fixed a laser scanner to the underside of a helicopter and flew it back and forth over the forests of Angkor. The instrument is called LiDAR. It fires hundreds of thousands of pulses of light a second down at the ground. Most strike the leaves, but a few slip through every gap in the canopy down to the forest floor and bounce back. Strip away the trees in the data, and what is left is the bare shape of the earth itself. Every mound, every ditch, every buried street. What appeared on the screen rewrote the map of the empire. The temples they had always known, but around and between them, the LiDAR revealed the ghost of the entire lost city. The grid of streets, the lines of the canals, the squares of vanished neighborhoods. The wooden city that had rotted away 800 years ago was still there, written faintly into the ground, invisible from the air and the ground alike, and now suddenly laid bare. And then it found cities no one had ever seen. On the slopes of Phnom Kulen, the sacred mountain where the empire was born, the scan revealed Mahendra Parvata, a planned city centuries older than Angkor Wat, with its own grid of avenues and reservoirs hidden beneath the forest for over 1,000 years. Far to the east, near another remote temple, an entire metropolis appeared in the data where the archaeologists had spent a decade on the ground finding nothing.
Evans described the moment
The city came up on the screen. They had been searching for it for 10 years, and all at once, he said, it more or less instantly appeared in front of them. The first survey in 2012 confirmed the buried shape of Mahendra Parvata on the mountain. A second, far larger survey 3 years later swept across some 900 square miles of forest, the most extensive scan an archaeological project had ever attempted. And when the data was cleaned, the scale of it stopped the researchers cold. By the time the surveys were done, they had uncovered a landscape of settlement far vaster than anyone had dared to guess. The Khmer Empire was not a handful of temples in the trees. It was one of the great urban civilizations of human history, and most of it had been lying in plain sight, just below the leaves the whole time. The lasers did more than measure the city. They began to explain its death. In the scans, the researchers could read the canals and embankments breaking and being patched and breaking again in the empire's final century. The marks of a water system straining against floods it could no longer hold. The same machine that revealed the lost city also showed, written into the ground, the slow failure that emptied it. The jungle swallowed the empire whole, and the jungle, it turns out, kept every bone. Henri Muho did not live to learn any of this. He died of fever in the forests of Laos, a year after he stood before Angkor Wat. The French built him a small tomb near the river, and then, slowly, exactly as it had taken the temples he loved, the forest took his grave too. For more than a century, it lay lost in the green, until a scholar stumbled on it again in the 1980s and cleared away the trees and read the name on the stone. The man who told the world about the empire the jungle swallowed was, in the end, swallowed by the same jungle. There is something almost fitting in it, as though the forest does not distinguish between the kings and the temples and the strangers who come to wonder at them. It simply waits and grows and takes back what it is given. Today, the temples are awake again. Beside the ruins, the town of Siem Reap has grown into a city of hotels and cafes, with a brand new international airport built a little farther from the temples, so that the plains no longer roar low over the 800-year-old stone. Each year before the heat, the visitors come to walk the long causeway in the dark and watch the sun climb behind the 5 towers. Angkor Wat is the heart of the modern country in a way it has not been for 600 years. It is on the flag. It is on the money. It is the first thing the world pictures when it hears the word Cambodia. But the heart beats unevenly now. In recent times, the crowds have thinned. The number of visitors to Angkor has fallen sharply, and the guides and drivers and families who depend on them feel every empty seat. The country is changing fast. New roads, new airports, new ambitions. And beneath all of it, the old problem, returned in a new form. Because Cambodia is losing its forest faster than almost any country on Earth.
The trees are falling for rubber,
For timber, for cashew, for land. Even inside the protected areas, even in the wild heart of the Cardamoms, the green is shrinking year by year. The forest that swallowed the empire and then preserved it and then surrendered its secrets to the lasers is itself now being swallowed by us. And that is where the story sits, unfinished. The LiDAR reveals more of the lost empire every year. We have never known so much about what the Khmer built, or how vast it truly was, or how completely the jungle held it. And at the very same moment, the jungle that did all of that holding is disappearing. We are uncovering the empire and erasing its grave in the same breath. The temples will stand a while yet. Stone is patient. The faces of the Bayon have watched over the forest for 800 years, and they are in no hurry. They have seen the empire rise and fall and be forgotten and be found again. They have seen the trees come and the lasers come and the crowds come and go. What they have not yet seen is what happens when the forest is gone. Whether a temple swallowed by jungle and then freed from it can survive in the open. Whether the country that carries Angkor on its flag can hold on to the wild green country around it. Whether the next thing the lasers find will be a city or a clearing. Muhot thought he had found a lost world. He had found the opposite, a world that had never been lost at all, only waiting, only quiet, only patient enough to outlast everyone who ever tried to claim it or carve it or forget it. The empire the jungle swallowed whole was never truly gone. The harder question is whether the jungle will be. Thank you for spending this time with us, here among the towers and the trees. If you would like to keep walking with us through the forgotten and the enduring corners of this world, consider subscribing. There is always more to find, just beneath the leaves.